Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and today I thought we'd get together and talk about fairy decks. So I kind of have been feeling the call to kind of work with some fairy decks. Now, part of this I think is due to the fact that I've been kind of looking at or paying special attention to the magical decks in my collection all throughout the month. And so that kind of got me to think about some of the other forms or other decks that I would consider to be a bit magical. And the first thing that came to mind was actually my fairy or fae decks. So we're not going to get too much into semantics here because there are various different approaches and mythologies and spellings and pronunciations of fae or fairy energy. So real quick, I'm going to go through kind of my personal classification for each. Now, please bear in mind that I am not an expert on fairies or fae. I have very little knowledge of them as a whole, and so I do approach these decks very mindfully, keeping in mind the fact that my knowledge and understanding is very, very limited. I'm just kind of beginning my journey into the work with this kind of energy. So from the little bit that I have kind of gathered over my little bits of research, watching other videos about fairies and fae, listening to some podcasts and things like that, I've kind of come up with a little bit of a classification for myself just to make it a little bit easier for me to kind of approach these in a way that makes sense to me. So I kind of see fairies in kind of two different realms. Now, a lot of people kind of break these into three different realms, and we'll talk about that just for a quick moment. My two classifications are fairy and fae. So fairy to me, which is funny, we have two of those right here. So here we see the Forest Fae, and here we see the Fairy Tarot cards. So to me, Fae is a much more primal, a much more otherworldly energy that I personally feel has a bit more kind of raw or natural power to the idea and the energy and the understanding of Fae. To me, the Fae are the protectors, the keepers of the land, but to me, they're also otherworldly, so they don't necessarily like exist in our world. It's also very natural, very in touch with the earth, very energetic, and very primordial or primal. That's how I see Fae energy. Fairy, on the other hand, I see more as the human attempt to capture that. So I'm not sure if that makes sense, but I see fairy in this sense, either spelled F-A-I-R-E or F-A-E-R Y or F-A-E-R-I-E. Like there's all kinds of different ways to spell that. But I see fairy in that sense as being the human interpretation of that energy, where I see fae as being kind of the natural energy in its kind of natural state. I hope that makes sense. And please do note that this is just my own personal classification as I'm trying to learn more about this energy and kind of wrap my brain around it and find a way to have it make sense in my brain. So for me, I have Fae, which is the natural, more primordial energy of the sort of magical creatures. And then I have fairy, which to me is more of the human attempt to bridge the gap between us and the fae. So I see this as being like if you had humans over here and then you have fairies and you have fae. So I kind of see that as being the evolution. Like we have the human realm, which I don't have a deck here to represent that, but you have humans, you have fairies, which is human trying to understand fae energy. That is how I see it. I hope that makes sense. Please know, again, that is just my own personal understanding. And as I learn more about fairies and fae and other magical beings of this sort, that may change. But for right now, in my very limited understanding, that's kind of where I'm sitting with it at this time. So I've got a couple of different decks here, actually quite a few decks, and I just thought it would be fun to kind of go through them and look at the decks that I would classify more in the Fae energy and more in the Fairy. So I do have mostly tarot here, and I think I only have 3 Oracle decks because actually I bought all 3 of these Oracle decks very recently, because when I was looking at trying to kind of get to know, understand, and work more with Fae or Fairy energy, I realized I didn't have any Oracle decks that fell in line with that. So I did a bunch of research. I spent a bunch of time watching walkthroughs and reviews and looking at the cards, and decided on a couple that I thought really fit what I was looking for. So let's go ahead and clear the space off and take a look at these decks. So we're first going to start by looking at the Fairy decks in my collection and kind of how they have helped me come to this little bit of an understanding. This particular deck here is the Mystic Fairy Tarot, and you can see here it is spelled F-A-E-R-I-E. This is a deck by Llewellyn. They did send me this deck to check out, just in full disclaimer here. I was hoping for the one with the big guidebook, because this deck, as we'll see here, I have already made a bag for it, but it is still in order because I haven't really taken the time to do a proper walkthrough or to really work with it yet. But this deck actually has something a little unique in it, and I only know this because I've watched lots and lots of videos on this deck before kind of deciding that I wanted to check it out myself. The larger version that comes with the big guidebook has full stories in it. I guess I could look, because this one does have a little white book in it. Maybe it has the full stories. But either way, the big book, yeah, I don't think it has the full stories in here. The big book tells a story, and there is a progression in the minors where we follow a story per each suit, and I really want to explore that. So I'm going to go ahead and see if I can get a copy of the book, or either that or just buy another copy of this deck with the big guidebook in it, because that's really what I was hoping for, because I think this deck really is one of those that would really benefit from knowing those stories. But in talking about Fairy decks, this deck to me, I am going to try to keep it in order. I guess it doesn't matter. I can put it back in order. This deck to me is a wonderful example of like sort of a Victorian inspired fairy deck. So I don't like the way that's doing. So when I'm looking at fairy decks, while this does feel very kind of in nature, I mean, we have all this lovely greenery, we have all the beautiful flowers, it does feel to me to be very much kind of tied into that idea, or that kind of creation that came out of the Victorian era, where we're looking at fairy as in very little beings, oftentimes with like little butterfly or moth wings. They're often very beautiful. Maybe the exception here, this little hermit, although I do really, really like him. But you can see in this Wheel of Fortune card, like they're all very cute and little and petite and beautiful. They are very human-like. They do have a little bit of pointy ears and they have wings, but essentially they are very human in their appearance. So I feel like this deck really represents that kind of idea of fairy, in a sense of, as I see it, humans trying to make sense of Fae energy. So again, if you were looking at like the kind of arc I was talking about, you would have humans here, you would have fairy in the middle, and you would have Fae on the other side. The exception in this deck is the Devil card, and I do feel that he looks a little bit more Fae, which is interesting that he's here as depicted as the Devil card, because he's not as, you know, human-esque as the rest of the fairies in this deck. So I thought that was really interesting, and I really love the energy and the artwork in this deck. And I love the mushrooms, But again, you'll see that this this deck follows characters throughout the suits, and I really, really want to know the stories. So I'm definitely going to have to get my hands on the bigger guidebook, because you can see we have the same characters. And I feel like by not having the big guidebook and being able to read the stories, that I'm totally missing a big piece of the puzzle with this deck. I feel like this deck really represents humans trying to understand Fae energy and seen through a Victorian lens. And so I think it's just a beautiful little deck that represents that really well. I love the soft color palette. I feel like this is a perfect like fairy deck for like springtime. But I think that looking at this deck, this is a wonderful deck as kind of like an introduction into fairy energy that I feel like is going to lead me down further into the Fae energy. I'm not sure if any of this is going to make any sense, but there you have it. So that's the Mystic Fairy Tarot. The other newer tarot deck that I brought into my collection, and I feel like I've had this deck before. In fact, like I'm almost certain I've had this deck before. Either that or the images are just so dang familiar that I feel like I've had it before. But I'm almost positive I've had this deck before. So this may be the second time this deck has come into my collection. This is the Fairy Tarot cards by Radleigh Valentine. This is one of those decks that the artwork is honestly not my favorite. But I do like the way Radleigh Valentine approaches the tarot, and I like the way he approaches it through the different lenses of themes. So like I have his Angel Tarot, and I really enjoy the way he approaches the tarot, strictly RWS, but approaches the tarot through the lens of Angel. And so I thought getting this deck to kind of help again, step into learning more about the Fae and Fairy realm. I thought this deck might be a good one because his approach is very approachable. Is the way that he approaches the tarot and tying these themes in tends to be really easy to understand, really digestible. And so I thought this might be an interesting one to kind of like a beginner fairy deck. Again, the artwork's not really my favorite. I much prefer something like this, or actually the Fae decks that we're going to see. Those are way more in line with my type of art style, but I'm more looking at the way he approaches the deck. I love the idea of the suits being of seasons. So we have spring, we have summer. I think summer is a lot of kind of Victorian style fairies. Again, we have that Victorian-esque energy with the very, very beautiful fairies with the little butterfly wings, and they kind of look, you know, little creatures. And then we have winter. Sorry, I'm kind of a little all over the place. I have no real direction for where this video is going, other than I just really wanted to sit down and explore these decks, and I thought we could do it together. But you can see here, like this, what is that? Is that a rat? Is that a bear? I don't even know. I think it's a rat. Anyway, so you can see this little bitty fairy here writing on it. Again, artwork not really my favorite. I do quite like the suit of Autumn though, which is the pentacles, and you know, that's always my favorite suit. So, but I really thought this might be a great one for approaching, kind of getting familiar with and just approaching the idea of integrating fairy energy into the tarot. So that's why I picked this one up. There's the Queen of Pentacles. I don't mind her so much, but I thought this would be a good one for kind of like a beginner fairy deck. So moving into oracle decks, what really started this whole thing, this whole journey, was that I was looking for a fairy oracle deck. And like I said, I did a bunch of research and watched a bunch of videos and found a couple that I thought that would work really well for helping me kind of explore and get to know fairy energy. So this one is the Wild Wisdom of the Fairy Oracle. In this instance, fairy is F-A-E-R-Y. This is a Blue Angel deck, and I was a little bit disappointed to find it's not on their new matte cardstock. I was really, really hoping for that, but it's not. Anyway, again, this one, I really like the keywords. I've looked through this deck several times now. You can see it's still in order. I haven't done any real work with it, but I've just really looked through it. I really, really like the keywords and the little write-ups on the cards of this deck. Some of the imagery is really, really beautiful, and some of it misses the mark a little bit for me. But you can see here that, again, we have all very beautiful creatures, beautiful people for to represent our fairies, you know, very almost elf-like in their appearance with the little wings that often resemble butterfly or moths. So I would see this again more in the realm of these two decks where we're looking at kind of that human understanding of fairy energy. So to me, these three decks are like humans trying to capture Fae energy, and this is how it comes out. Maybe this is how they show themselves to us sometimes. But look at this one. I mean, this is like, this little fairy looks like Barbie. So, you know, I do really like the keywords though, and I do really like a lot of the illustrations. Some of them are a little like bordering on like romance novel cover for me, like here, but this is the card of fairy tale. So, I mean, what is a romance novel if not a fairy tale, basically, right? So it just, you know, it's not perfect. None of these decks are perfect. They all have shortcomings. There's no such thing as a perfect deck. There is no diversity in any of these decks, really. Now, I know there's a lot of different ways to break it down because based on the spelling of fairy, there's like subcategories within that, but that is like way beyond my scope right now. I'm just taking it at a very basic cursory level where I'm just trying to get to know this energy and trying to understand more about working with fairy or fae energy. I do feel like this is a place where I need to kind of start, and I'm hoping to kind of dive deeper into kind of making that transition from the human trying to capture the idea of fae energy, and it's kind of manifested in this more human looking aspect that we see here in these three decks. And remember, I'm still learning, so none of this may be correct. Take it for what it is, which is me just learning and exploring and sharing with you along the way. So looking at Fae energy, again, to me, that's a much more kind of natural, primal, almost primordial manifestation of the energy, whereas I feel like the fairy is more of the humanized version of it. And the deck that I think for me comes to mind that crosses the bridge between those two is the Tarot of a Hidden Realm. And this is, I think, the oldest Fae or fairy deck that I have in my collection, like the one I've had the longest. To me, this bridges these two things because this does feel very much in the world of Fae to me. It feels ancient. It feels natural. It feels like these are worlds and energies that exist beyond what human can see, right? Beyond our current reality. However, it is full of very beautiful beings for the most part. And even like the older ones, I think they're still very beautiful beings. So I feel like this deck to me, while it does feel very, very entrenched in Fae energy for me, I feel like it is kind of the bridge between fairy and Fae, that's how I'm perceiving this deck. That's how I'm looking at it. Because again, we have these very human-like figures that are drawing us into their world. For me, this is the hybrid. This is taking the human construct of fairy and transforming it back to its, or maybe stripping away the layers of humanity and bringing it into the more natural Fae world. And that's kind of how I see this particular deck. I mean, if you can see, if you look at her, these dragonflies are quite large, so she must be fairly small. These flowers are quite large, so she must be fairly small. And again, we're looking at really beautiful people, really beautiful creatures. So again, to me, this is just the bridge between the two kind of areas. And I feel like moving from fairy, that human idea of trying to capture Fae energy or trying to understand Fae energy. And we do that a lot with a lot of different things. We humanize it. That is our realm of understanding. We are humans, and so we see things through a human lens. So trying to understand energies outside of the human construct can be a little bit difficult for people as a whole. And so I think that we have these things where we use human constructs to express other ways of being outside of the human existence. And I think this is a case with, that's kind of how I see fairy. That's, again, a very humanized version of this energy. And the Tarot of a Hidden Realm, I think it's one of my favorite decks. I just absolutely love it. Feels like that bridge to me in between those two. These are the more human-esque versions, drawing us in and drawing us deeper into the world of the Fae. So kind of going a little bit deeper into our journey into the Fae realm here, this is the Fairy Lights Tarot. And this is, of course, completely trimmed down. I've taken all of the titles off of it. This, to me, goes even deeper into the Fae realm. We're moving further away from human constructs and moving more into a kind of fantasy or otherworldly type of realm that kind of straddles the liminal space between, I guess you could say. And to me, this deck does that beautifully. Really, just in looking at this artwork, we have a lot of little kind of creatures that are not human for the most part. They may have human-esque features here and there, but the majority of the little creatures in this deck have a very otherworldly look and energy to them. So again, I feel like we're kind of like diving a little bit deeper, just drawing us a little bit deeper into the realm of the Fae, kind of pulling us a little bit further away from our human notions and our human ideas, and kind of coming into understanding of something different. So actually, before I got that one, I had this deck, and this is Tarot of the Secret Forest. This is the one that has the black and white illustrations on the back. And I do have them all mixed in. Again, another trimmed deck. But I feel like this deck takes us even further into the bramble, even further into that realm. And most of the creatures in this deck are other, to me anyway. They have kind of other energy. They're kind of like part bug, part maybe human, but there's a very raw kind of natural energy to this deck. And I love this card because I think this card really kind of encapsulates that idea of drawing the human, because this figure to me looks a bit more human, drawing the human down into the Fae world, getting really deep in that energy. And I feel like this card really encapsulates that wonderfully. But to me, this is a deck of really going deep into the brambles and the brush, and diving deep into that Fae energy. I don't think this is actually even billed as like a fairy deck or a Fae deck, but to me, all the creatures have wings. Maybe it is. It's been a long time since I've read the guidebook. I've had this deck for quite some time. But to me, this deck feels like it's really getting deep into the realm of the Fae. So the next deck that we're going to take a look at is probably my favorite among all of these. This is the Tarot of the She. Now the She, I've heard them sometimes referred to as Fae and sometimes not. So I think it depends on what resources, probably what culture you're also talking about. But this deck, again, it's another trimmed deck because I've taken it down to just the artwork. This deck to me represents Fae energy at its most powerful. Like it's in its natural environment and its inherent natural power. This for me personally is like my personal power deck. This is the deck that I go to when I need to really tap into some powerful energy. And these illustrations, I think, just really evoke that energy and that idea. Now, the creatures in this deck look more, I think, a little bit more alien. We're getting even further away from those human-esque appearances. Some of them do have a little bit of a human quality to them, but they almost have a like alien kind of appearance as well. And so for me, this deck is just really diving even deeper into that Fae energy, but this is seeing the other side of it, where I feel like these decks kind of all tap into the sort of natural, earthy type energy that we often associate with the Fae. This to me pulls in that really powerful cosmic energy as well. It's of course very deep in the earth too, but there is something also very otherworldly about this deck. It's kind of cosmic. It kind of brings some of that cosmic universal energy into the realm of the Fae, or maybe the other way around. Maybe the Fae are expanding their energy outward. Again, I am no expert. This is me just trying to come to some understanding, to get to know these energies, and to find a way to connect with them in a way that makes sense for me. Now, this deck is one that I've connected with quite frequently, and I use it quite often. It's a kind of powerhouse deck in my collection. So it's not that I'm trying to connect with these decks in order to be able to read with them. I'm trying to connect with these decks in order to understand the inherent energy. So for me, the Tower of the She is really about tapping into that very primal, very powerful, but very elemental Fae energy. So this feels like if the Fae were to encompass, elemental energy, this feels like what it would be, what it would look like. The last one that I purchased, actually, and again, you'll see these are all in order. This is the Oracle of the Dragon Fae. It does have some of the art by the same artist that was in the Wild Wisdom of the Fairy Oracle. I actually didn't know that when I bought this deck. It says featuring artwork by Raven Phelan. That is Dreams of Gaia. Selena Fenish, which she did the Wild Wisdom of the Fairy Oracle as well. And I may be slaughtering these, so I totally apologize. Jimmy Manton, Tony Carmine Salerno, and more. So definitely some big name Oracle deck artists and creators that I recognize there, but I actually didn't realize that it was a multi-artist collection, and I usually don't like that, but we'll see how it works in this deck. This one I was really excited when it came because it was on the new beautiful Blue Angel matte cardstock, which I think is just fantastic. So this deck, again, I guess looking at it now, I can see the different art styles. This deck I got because it said Dragon Fae on it. And I felt like these images and these keywords really tapped into the idea of Fae energy. So if you see here, we had Grandmother Magics. We have the Time Guardian, Morgan Le Fay. That looks like Tony Carmine Salerno, right? A lot of these I am not terribly familiar with, so I'm looking forward to getting to know them. But they do feel like they're probably kind of steeped in that Fae tradition. And honestly, I had a hard time finding a Oracle deck, besides the next one that we're going to look at, that really spoke to me of Fae energy in the way that these tarot decks do. I feel like this one comes the closest from what I saw and kind of the decks that I researched, but again, it's not a perfect fit for what I'm kind of looking at here, but I do feel like it has a lot of that energy to it. I do see dragons as kind of in that same kind of realm. Also mermaids, but that we're going to do a whole separate video on that because that's a whole separate, it's related, but it's a whole separate thing for me. The last little deck that I picked up is the Forest Fae. This is one of the new decks by Rockpool Publishing. They sent me a couple of their little mini decks. This was not one of them. I think it might be on the way to me, but I'm totally impatient and I had to get it. So this one feels very much like in the Fae realm. These characters are far from human, and I feel like this is like Fae energy kind of at its like and it's wild, if that makes sense. I'm not sure if any of this is going to make sense to anybody, but we're rolling with it because this is what I'm doing today. I really love these little creatures. They feel, some of them do have a bit more of a human-esque look, and some of them are very far from human. But I feel like these are kind of fae and like their natural habitat, their natural being, kind of like more along the lines of the Brian Froud Fae. And yes, I am very much aware of his decks. I have had one of his, I think it's his Fairy Oracle, and that deck had a super trickstery energy to it, and it didn't quite work for me. It may, now that I'm kind of diving deeper into this and kind of exploring this energy a little bit more, I might pick it back up again and kind of give it another try. I did pass it along, but and yes, that would be quintessential Fae Oracle deck, right? I think Kelly from the Truth in Story had said it too. Like, I think Brian Froud sees fairies, and I think he paints what he sees. And I didn't have it because I didn't include it here because I have had it, and it had a very trickstery energy for me, and we didn't quite click. And I don't know if I just wasn't in the right place for it or what. But again, like I said, I may pick it up again and I may try it again. But at this point, I'm kind of just, I feel like I'm not quite ready for that yet. Like, I feel like that's really intense Fae energy, and I don't feel like I'm quite there yet. I feel like I'm more along the lines of this little Fae energy. With this little forest fae, which they are, I think, because they're cute, right? They're not very human most of the time, but they are very cute. And I feel like this is really approachable energy that I can kind of get a better feel and understanding for fae energy through decks like this. And then maybe at that point, maybe I'll be ready for the Brian Froud oracles, which are absolutely stunning, but really powerful. And I just don't think I'm quite there yet. I don't know if this is actually going to make any sense to anybody else but me. But if we're looking at the decks that I have here and kind of how I see them and how I personally experience their energy, because again, for me, this is all just my personal perspective and how I see it. I could be completely wrong, or other people might have other ways that they approach or work with or understand these energies, and that's totally cool. This is just me trying to kind of make sense of where I'm at in my just beginning, just dipping my toes into exploring Fae and Fairy energy. So if we're looking at it in kind of a learning trajectory here, I feel like the Fairy Tarot cards would be like a good place I would start, just to kind of introduce me to the idea of fairy energy. And I see that not really because of the artwork, but mostly because of the way that Radley Valentine approaches his decks, and that they're very approachable. They're very easy to understand, and I feel like they're wonderful beginner decks. So even though I'm not a beginner tarot reader, I'm definitely a beginner when it comes to fairy or fae energy. So I feel like this is a good starting off point. I also really like that it's divided into seasons, because that does tap into my own personal seasonal practice. So I feel like this is a good place for me to start. I feel like the Mystic Fairy Tarot, particularly once I get the book and I can learn the stories, would kind of take me a little bit deeper into that journey, because again, we do have stories that are associated with these cards. Unfortunately, I can't tell you what they are because I don't have that book right now, but I feel like that's kind of giving you the opportunity to get to know the fairy world, right? It's kind of like easing you into that deeper fae energy that we're going to end up with over here. So we have the kind of starting out with the Fairy Tarot, that kind of beginner's realm. And then the Mystic Fairy Tarot, we're going to kind of get to know that fairy energy a little bit more on a deeper level, like a little bit more personal. And then we have down here the Wild Wisdom of the Fairy Oracle, which again has those kind of same type of fairy energy, where we have the kind of human expression of fae energy. And that's kind of how I see fairy. That's the human expression of fae energy in my very, very limited understanding and vocabulary when it comes to all of this stuff. So we have this kind of little triad here that kind of helps us understand, get to know, have a little introduction into fairy energy, into this idea of something other than human. So then we have the Tarot of a Hidden Realm, which I feel like is kind of the bridge between those two worlds, because it does have a lot of very human-esque qualities to it, but I feel like it's very deeply ingrained in Fae energy. So it's kind of drawing us into that realm, right? This is kind of the bridge. It's the guide that's beckoning us. I will walk the journey with you. I will show up in a way that you can understand, but I'm going to bring you deeper into this world. I just realized these two were backwards. So let's fix that real quick. Sorry for the interruption. So then we have it kind of pulling into the Fairy Lights Tarot, where we're getting a little bit deeper into that world, right? We're still kind of bringing in some of those human constructs and human-esque ideas, but we're kind of drawing it deeper in, you know, into the brambles, into the other. And again, we continue deepening that journey in the Tarot of a Secret Forest. So again, still some humanized ideas mixed in here, but we're going deeper in, just drawing deeper into the woods. So in this kind of area, I feel like we have the Oracle of the Dragon Fae here, which does kind of help us, again, make that transition from fairy human construct into the deeper, more naturalistic, more primal Fae energy. So I feel like that's a good oracle to kind of help us make that transition, go deeper into those ideas. And I feel like this little deck here, the Forest Fae, would kind of be like in between these two, so to speak, even though these are oracles and these are tarot. But I feel like it kind of represents more of coming into what maybe natural Fae look like. The if I had the Brian Froud fairy, that would probably be at the end, because I feel like that is just like, that is succinct Fae energy, I think. But again, I don't feel like I'm ready for it, so I don't have it. But I feel like close to that would be this Forest Fae, which feels like a kind of more approachable version of that, where they do feel like they are otherworldly creatures and not so steeped in human construct. And tapping into that really primal elemental energy, we have Tarot of the She, which to me feels like really diving deep into that energy and really letting it just manifest and explode in a way that is very wild and natural and primal and primordial. So I feel like this kind of has this trajectory for me of energies that I need to kind of be stepping my way through, which is kind of funny because I've used these 4 decks like a lot. These are not new decks to me, as I mentioned. I love using Tarot of the Hidden Realm. It works wonderful for just general readings as well. I often use these 2 decks together. I think I might have a video on it. So again, I use those decks, and the Tarot of the She is a deck I use all the time, particularly for when I'm trying to pull out personal power. But these aren't decks that I've used looking at it going, I'm going to pull Fae energy into my work. That's not how I've ever approached them. I've just approached them as their tarot decks with Fae on them, right? Or Fairy on them, or She on them. So it's going to be really interesting, I think, to explore the decks, not just through their kind of thematic lens, but also to really dive deep into the energy that, for me personally, each one represents. I'm really excited to kind of explore this deeper, and I don't know if this video will make any sense to anybody else, but I hope that maybe you found it, if not helpful, at least maybe interesting or entertaining to watch. Again, I am not an expert on any of this stuff. I'm no expert on Fae or Fairy energy or working with that energy. This is all very, very new to me, but I love to incorporate my decks into my work when I'm exploring other energies or other practices, and I love to pull in decks when I can. So as I was looking at getting started, kind of exploring more about Fae and Fairy energy, I really came to my decks to look at, you know, what do I have that really represents that for me? There might be others in my collection that I missed, but these are the ones that really came to the forefront for me, whereas really it started with these 4, and then I was like, but these 4 to me don't feel like fairy decks. They feel like Fae decks. And as I was developing my own understanding of what that means for me personally, I realized that I was missing decks that really felt like fairy energy to me. So that's why I pulled these ones in. And, then really when it came down to it, I was like, I don't have any oracles. And sometimes oracle can help me kind of explore deeper or pull out additional elements that I don't always necessarily look to when I'm just working with tarot, because I'm always pulling in tarot association. An oracle for me steps away from that and kind of opens it up a little bit and broadens it when I'm looking at working with cards in this particular way. Again, I know I'm missing the Brian Froud. I know. I will probably get that deck at some point, but at this point, I'm not ready for that one. That to me is full on Fae. Like no two ways about it. And I'm not quite there yet. I feel like that's a little bit more advanced for me. And I'm looking at this as starting my journey working with fairy, moving deeper and deeper into Fae energy. And then maybe I will come out the end with some Brian Froud oracles and have a really good understanding of those. But for right now, I feel like that energy is it's above and beyond where I'm at currently. So I don't know if any of this made any sense to anybody else, or if you didn't find it informational. Hopefully at least you found it interesting or entertaining, but it was really something that I wanted to do, is just really sit down and explore my decks and looking at it through that learning trajectory and becoming familiar and understanding the energy inherent in these particular decks, really looking at the difference between Fairy and Fae and kind of solidifying my thoughts on that and how that energy is moving for me. And I thought it might just be fun to share. So hopefully you enjoyed it at the very least. Again, if you know of a deck that I should have that like you think that just really is missing from my little Fairy Fae collection here, please feel free to share with me in the comments below. I would love to know that. I know the Brian Froud though. I do know that one. And I would also love to know what your experiences are with any of these decks, if you have any of them, or if you do any Fae or Fairy work. I would love to hear about that. So please feel free to share with me in the comments below. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this look at my Fairy and Fae decks, and I look forward to seeing you again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.